So countries which have an average, a higher average primary balance to potential GDP or to real GDP, that means more fiscal discipline, they also are more counter-cyclical. So that's interesting too. So again, that should be something I put as a control on my second stage regression. Another one here is inflation. So why is why do you think that fiscal discipline is good? Well, because counter-cyclical means that the government may have to borrow in bad times to help firms in bad times. But if you are more counter-cyclical, people know that you will reimburse later on. It's easier for government to raise the public debt in recession when it's more credible that the government will repay later on. So fiscal discipline makes it easier for government to be counter-cyclical. There is a value to have fiscal discipline. Inflation is the other way around. When you have higher inflation, you are less counter-cyclical. So those are other covariates, you see. We could look also at openness of capital and credit market, and you can show that too much openness can make it more difficult to be counter-cyclical. So there is a whole theory of counter-cyclicality. By the way, let me say something on cyclicality. Alesina and Tabellini had an interesting paper where they showed that the combination of corruption and democracy can make it very difficult to be counter-cyclical. Because in good time, we had that problem in France with Jospin. There was the cagnotte. You see, we had money, and the government was running a surplus, and instead of keeping the surplus aside, having rainy days funds for bad days, to win the election, he gave the thing away. You see what I mean? Otherwise, people said, well, what will he do with the money? So the combination of, it's not really corruption, but, democracy and short-termism can lead you to be pro-cyclical. So there have been a whole theory, and that's not the focus of my talk. But that's a whole very interesting agenda, which is to understand what makes some countries more or less pro or counter-cyclical, okay? So that's the what I want to get. So now I show you the second stage. So now I show you the results from this equation. So far I showed you the results from this one, but now the results from this one. So I want to know if the gamma coefficient is positive or not. So can you see the tables? Can you see the tables behind? Not very well. Oh God. Who cannot see the tables? You see the table? Well, what this table do, they regress growth. So this is value-added growth in sectors, so in industry over a 20-year period. And I regress it on those are interaction terms between the first four columns are interaction terms between external financial dependence of the sector in the US and the extent to which you have counter-cyclical fiscal policy. And you see that when you have a more you see the coefficients are positive significant. Now when you have different coefficients, because I measure either I take total fiscal balance to GDP or primary fiscal balance to GDP, or I divide by actual GDP of my potential GDP in the first stage equation. That's why I get 4 columns instead of 1. But they do the same thing. That the more financially dependent a sector is, the more growth enhancing it is for that sector, that the country has a counter-cyclical policy. Now the last 4 coefficients are negative. Why are they negative? They are negative because I use asset tangibility as a measure of credit constraint. But when you have more asset tangibility, you are less credit constrained. So it's a reverse measure of credit constraint. That's why I have a negative coefficient there. With the microphone? Yeah, let me sit down a bit here. Okay, to make your life easier. So here is the same thing with productivity growth. Same thing. When you take labor productivity growth or value-added growth, you get the same thing. When you are more credit constrained, you have, a more counter-cyclical policy has a more growth-enhancing effect. So next, I move to other cyclicality measures. So that I use the Barrow equation. And the Barrow equation was this one at the bottom of this, instead of using the first one. And if you use the Barrow equation, you find similar results. So you get again that you have positive significant interaction when you look at financial dependence, and of course asset tangibility, you have to reverse the sign. But they are exactly the same results. So now I want to get to the asymmetry. I told you that it all comes from the fact that by being counter-cyclical, you help firms when they need to be helped. Firms' volatility is particularly bad in bad times. It's no big deal in good times. So what you do there is that, in fact, And that I can show here. So here I restrict, I do the regression for years where the GDP gap is less than the median value. So I look at years which are the bad years. And you see in the bad years, the effects are very significant, bigger than before, more significant than before. Whereas if you look at the good years, you see it's either less or not important. So really, it's in bad times that firms are credit constrained. So volatility damages firms more in bad times than it helps them in good times. That's the key ingredient, and I have it here. The policy of counter-cyclicality helps firms in bad times particularly, and that's why it's an asymmetric effect, and that's what drives the result. Okay. In good times, firms are doing well anyway. They escape mostly the credit constraint anyway. Okay. So here I look at other stories. You remember I told you, that counter-cyclicality is related with size of government, it's related to fiscal discipline, it's related to inflation, it might be related to financial development in the country. So I could say, well, maybe what you capture in your regression is not so much the effect of counter-cyclical policy, but these effects of these other covariates, you see? It could be that, in fact, you're talking about the effect of inflation, you see, or the effect of size, or the effect of discipline. So what I do here is to control for those. So in each column, I control for one of these things. I control for financial development. I control for the monetary policy. I control for inflation. I control for government size. I control for fiscal discipline. And you see that it doesn't change the coefficient. You see here, I put the interaction between asset tangibility. You see the second row is always the same. So you don't affect, so the effect doesn't come primarily from the counter-cyclicality of fiscal policy. So it doesn't mean, by the way, that inflation and fiscal discipline don't matter, but they don't matter on their own. They matter through the fact they help you being more counter-cyclical. Do you see what I mean? The lesson is not that these guys don't matter, but they matter to the extent that they allow you to have a more counter-cyclical fiscal policy. You see, that's the thing. So then you can instrument. You see, you could say, well, your financial policy counter-cyclicality that you have here, it's a very kind of remote variable. Why don't you have a direct instrument for it? So we use legal and political variable as instruments, and the thing works equally well. So here we use legal and political variables, legal origins, or we use a degree of centralization or decentralization of government, and those are very good instruments. And when you use those as instruments for the fiscal policy counter-cyclicality, you still find similar results. So that at least gives you something, if you are worried that the fiscal policy was coming from an equation where you have, output on both sides of the equation in a sense. That helps you make sure that you capture, something which is exogenous. So then you can look at the magnitude of the effect. What the experiment I'm doing here is to say, well, suppose you are first a sector which is not very credit constrained in a country which is not very counter-cyclical. And I move to becoming the upper quartile in terms of credit constraint in a country which is much more counter-cyclical. How much growth do I gain? And you see the magnitudes are like between 1% and 2% per year. You would say this is enormous, but it's in line with the Rajan-Zingales. They get, for their thing, 1%. So it's in the same order of magnitude as the Rajan-Zingales. Of course, you would say those are enormous effects, but no country, Greece will not become Sweden. Maybe in my lifetime it will, but not in the next 5 years. You see what I mean? And not just because Strauss-Kahn is leaving, it's not. But those are important effects, but they're credible effects, because what I'm talking about here, you see, those are defensive effects. We are looking at manufacturing sectors only that represent less than 40% of total GDP, and moving from the 25th to the 75th percentile in both credit constraint and counter-cyclicality is an unlikely move. You see what I mean? So but still you find, effects which are sizable. So now I want to show you. I told you a story about R&D. I said, why is it good to have counter-cyclical policy? Because you can help firms sustain growth-enhancing investments. So one of them is R&D. So here I'm redoing the regression where I was regressing growth, but instead of regressing growth on the interaction between counter-cyclical fiscal policy and the extent to which the sector is credit constrained, I look at average R&D over the period. And you see that the effects are the same. I mean, R&D reacts more positively on average to more counter-cyclical policy. You see, it's the same with R&D as you get with. But if I had data on training, which I don't have, I would be very interested, and I bet you I would find similar regression. So it fosters R&D in firms to have more counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So far, what do? I know that stabilizing fiscal policy raises long-run industry growth, the more so in industry with higher financial dependence or with lower asset tangibility. This effect is particularly driven by what happens in low states. It is economically significant. The next step is to go to monetary policy. So let me go to monetary policy. Monetary policy, I will do the same as before, except that FPC becomes MPC. So I still look at the growth over a 25-year period of industry I in country C, with a regress on the industry fixed effect alpha I, on the country fixed effect beta C, and now I control for initial income, I should have said before, but the thing is the interaction between the counter-cyclicality of the monetary policy and the extent to which the sector is financially constrained. But I look at two kinds of constraint now. I look not only at credit constraint, which I measure by the extent to which the sector in the US is financially dependent or has low asset tangibility. I look at liquidity constraints. You see, liquidity is the extent. You could have a sector which is in very good financial health, not really credit constrained, but needs liquidity. So, for example, sectors with high inventory to sales ratio, with high labor cost to sales ratio, you need to pay your workers. With a cash conversion cycle, which is, large, big, you need liquidity. And that is also really important. And we'll see that that plays a big role as well. You see? So the idea is that a more counter-cyclical monetary policy means lower interest rate in recession and higher interest rate in expansion, helps not only firms that are credit constrained, but firms that are also liquidity constrained to sustain R&D and other type of growth-enhancing investment over the cycle. Okay? So the data set, now the monetary policy counter-cyclicality, I have an auxiliary equation, which is different from before. The left-hand side is the short-run real interest rate, you see? And I regress the short-term real interest rate on the GDP gap, and that is the result from that regression that I call monetary counter-cyclicality. Now, you could have just done a Taylor rule. That would do as well. You could use a Taylor rule and estimate the Taylor rule. Yes? Yeah, but I look at OECD only. Huh? I look at OECD countries only. Alors, the euro, I will show you how it goes, because here you see, even though they are part of the euro, they are affected differently, because you see, the European Central Bank adjusts the interest rate, but then it corresponds to the cycles of the different countries differently. That's what happens, okay? And so, the fact, here it's true, it partly comes from the policy. Here I'm just asking, is it good or bad that your short-term real interest rate are pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical? That's all I am claiming. Then you will ask the question, how would you achieve different, it's true that the problem within the Eurozone is that you cannot adapt to the cycles of all the countries. And in fact, it adapts better to some countries than others. And that's another question. Here I'm just asking, is it good or bad to have this short-term? Then you can ask the question, how would you deal with that in the Eurozone? And that, I think, is a big question. And that I'm not dealing with it. Okay? So, for example, here what's interesting is that Portugal, Finland, for some reason, they have a pro-cyclical interest rate, whereas Great Britain, Sweden have counter-cyclical interest rate. But what's also interesting is that Portugal is a small country, in the Eurozone. So obviously, the ECB tries to target average inflation. You see, they don't target